Every area, in all parts of the world, have those area-specific urban legends that just refuse to die. Whether the stories are about a haunted asylum on the outskirts of the city, a creature that lives in the nearby woods, or a ghost that haunts a lonely stretch of road outside of town, there is always a common thread within the tales. No one has ever been to these places, seen the creatures, or witnessed any hauntings with their own eyes. There are members of every generation who will proclaim that they know someone whose brother's best friend's sister went to that haunted house with 13 floors that used real blood and snakes and spiders, and is so scary that no one has ever made it all the way through. Those same people will swear by these stories without ever being able to provide a shred of evidence or a name of someone who could provide proof of the claims simply because everyone around here knows that it's a true story. The storytellers eventually pass the tales on to their children, who modify them just enough to keep up with the changing times, and the cycle continues. Hello everybody, and welcome back. I haven't really talked about them on this channel, but I love urban legends. While many times they just serve as good campfire stories, I also really appreciate the fact that they kind of give insight to that area that they come from. See, each urban legend is unique to the area, like the text I just read said. And there's something that makes that infinitely more intimate than just some random horror story that someone would tell. I love the thought that everyone in this area knows about this urban legend, and sometimes it's different. I know there are urban legends from my own area that I've heard told several different ways with several different moving characters and plot points and whatnot throughout them, all ending on roughly the same page, but still being different enough to make everyone question what's the true story if there even is one. And I think that's why I like them so much and have always been fascinated with them. And most of you who have been on my channel before know I'm also fascinated with internet horror, specifically creepypastas for the sake of today's video. And luckily there is a creepypasta I feel combines the allure and intimacy of urban legends with creepypastas and internet horror in a perfect way. And that story would be none other than The Showers. This story was written by Dylan Sindelar. I think I'm pronouncing that right. So there will be a link in the description if you want to check the story out for yourself, which I would highly implore you to do so. But if you want to just sit here and listen to me summarize it for some reason, thank you for watching. This will be like a lot of my other videos though, where there won't be a whole ton to see on the screen. I'm sorry, there's just not much, if any, imagery to go along with this, so I'll put up little flashes of text and some images when I feel it appropriate. That isn't just overloading your screen with them, but this is more a video to have on in the background of things, like most of my videos are. So, you know, you can clean your room, do some chores, play some video games, whatever you need to do. This will be a fine video in the background of things, so do with that information what you will. But without further ado, let's dive in to The Showers. The paragraphs I read at the start of this video were the opening 2 paragraphs of The Showers, and introduced the fact that urban legend will be an important part of this story. Our narrator is a young man named Jack, who says that he too adores urban legends, and as a child would often go and seek them out, trying to find all the best ones he could for the area that he lived in. And as time would pass, Jack would go on to make up his own urban legends just to tell friends and classmates at school to try and freak them out. Jack's parents had to move a lot for work, meaning he was rarely ever at a school or a town for longer than a semester or two. So, Jack would delight in telling these classmates the urban legends, either true ones or ones he made up, to try and freak them out, and it wouldn't really matter if they believed him or not, since he would be gone very soon. And he would typically cater them to whatever part of the country he was living in at the time. He would tell stories of a haunted pizza parlor in New York, or his grandpa's run-in with the Jersey Devil. However, Jack would get bold as he told these stories, and would eventually break the golden rule of them. He put himself in the stories. This meant that Jack would have to tell the story the exact same way every single time, making sure he didn't leave out any details or add new ones, as to keep up with the charade, as any discrepancies would likely foil this. And he would tell them convincingly too, doing a little bit of acting as he told them, getting a trembling voice for the more dramatic parts, or even getting a little teary-eyed in the emotional aspects of the story, acting like it was actually difficult for him to recollect, or that he was still horrified of the incident all this time later. And either as a testament to his storytelling ability, or the attention span of his teenage classmates, no one ever called him out on these stories. All this is to say that Jack's obsession with urban legends led to his current predicament as he writes this story now, one that we will discover as the story unfolds. He says that for years, he was the boy who cried wolf when it came to recounting these urban legends, but that this time, he can say with absolute certainty, the wolf is real. Due to Jack's constant moving, he never really had the time to make meaningful connections. He just wasn't around an area long enough to do so, and this was the case for his teachers as well. Oftentimes, Jack was the class clown, and because of this, many of his teachers didn't like him. But again, he didn't mind because he wouldn't be around long enough for it to matter. He'd be gone before the next semester started more than likely, so why shouldn't he try and have a little bit of fun? However, there was one teacher that Jack made a meaningful connection with, one he respected to no end, his sophomore social studies teacher, Mr. Mays. Jack, and from what he could understand, the rest of his classmates, all thought Mr. Mays was the coolest. For one, he was very passionate about what he taught, which if anyone's had a boring teacher, you know this is very important to have engagement with your students. He made jokes that were actually funny, had up-to-date pop culture references which the students appreciated, listened to cool music, and, more importantly to them, Mr. Mays would swear on occasion when getting really into a lecture, and Jack would say that a teacher who swears in his eyes is the coolest a teacher can be. And yeah, it's funny now, as an adult, being like, oh, the teacher who swore was cool, like reading that in text. I can't lie, I completely agreed while I was in school. Anytime we'd have a teacher swear, I was like, this guy's the freaking coolest. So I was actually gonna be a teacher, fun fact. That was initially what I was gonna go to college for. Could you imagine me as a teacher? That'd be horrifying. No, I just make YouTube videos now, so anyways, Mr. Mays was a really good teacher and a really cool teacher at the same time. Around the time of Halloween, Mr. Mays had his classroom decorated throughout the month of October. You know, we had the little cardboard cartoon cutouts of black cats and pumpkins and whatnot. But then on the day of Halloween itself, the students walked in and would see that Mr. Mays had changed his classroom. We walked into the classroom and were surprised to find the blinds drawn, sheets over the smaller windows, candles lighting the room, and a single, frowning jack-o'-lantern sitting on a stool in front of the desks. Mr. Mays sat at his desk, just watching the students come into class and take their seats. He didn't have to ask anyone to be quiet because the moment everyone walked into the room, they were either too excited to care about petty conversations or too confused to bother with them. The students took their seats as Mr. Mays began his lecture. He spoke quietly to set the mood and took a seat on a chair right next to the jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room. Mr. Mays would say that Halloween was his favorite holiday, and he wanted to share with the class exactly why that was. There is a funny little bit in this scene where, as Mr. Mays is talking, a girl raises her hand, and Mr. Mays doesn't even look at her. He just says, the papers are due next Tuesday, and she just like silently puts her hand down. I just couldn't imagine walking into a classroom on Halloween where it's clear your social studies teacher is about to do something not related to the class more than likely, but tell a spooky story or something along those lines, and you're just some nerd concerned about the homework. I mean, she's likely going places, and will probably be very successful, but screw-ups like me, we want to hear the story. Anyways, shortly after graduating from college, Mr. Mays and a group of his friends decided that they wanted to go on a road trip around the country for the entirety of their summer. Being adventurous college kids, they didn't bring a map. They didn't really even have any sort of plan other than they knew they needed to be back in New York by the end of summer. So they just hit the road and went wherever it took them. And they did so, exploring the United States and having all around a good time, celebrating their graduation from college before real life would start after. And they were somewhere in Nebraska when they decided they would treat themselves and actually stay at a hotel for the night. But after taking in a little bit of the town, one of the friends realized he sort of knew where they were. Not enough to navigate them or anything, but he could tell that his grandparents lived nearby the town they were in. And he was confident that his grandparents would let them stay the night. They'd basically get a good place to sleep instead of just having to crash in their truck again, and it would certainly be a lot cheaper than paying for a hotel for all of them. So they got a refund, and then started exploring the town, trying to find the guy's grandparents. He doesn't exactly have directions to where they live. He doesn't completely know. It's more of a, I'll know it when I see it. But he does know that they live on a farm off of a dirt road outside of town. Still, the group was down to drive around for a little while and see if they could find it. However, being out of town and having no real sense of direction, the group got lost quickly and would find themselves driving through miles and miles of cornfields, just trying to find their way back even, and hoping that they would stumble upon the grandparents' farm. But it had been several hours since they began their search. But that's when they found a dirt road leading through a wooded area, and the friend was confident that they were on the right path. In retrospect, Mr. Mays would call this road a dark path to hell. They drove through the woods for about 15 minutes before stumbling upon a clearing. There was a small building, and it was clear that the lights were on inside. And some yards next to it, there was a silo on the property as well. The friend would look at it and determine that this wasn't his grandparents' house, but since the lights were on, he figured someone was home. So they had hoped that they could go knock on the door, ask the owners of the house if they knew his grandparents or knew where they lived, kind of running off the idea of everyone knows everywhere in these parts. And then they'd use the directions, of course, to go find their grandparents. But as they drove closer, it became clear that this building wasn't a house, but instead was sort of a large building used for storing chickens. However, the lights were still on, so maybe there would still be someone inside that they could ask for help. They parked the truck and got out, all walking to the building as a group. As they approached, they noticed that the entrance was a sliding door, and one that sat half open. They peered inside and saw that the room was completely empty, serving far more as a long hallway with these fluorescent lights that hung down from the ceiling and illuminated the room as though it were daylight inside. They were about to leave, but one of the friends said that he was sure that he had seen someone moving around whenever they had pulled up. So figuring that they were just somewhere on the property, they went to look for him. They really didn't want to drive around in the Nebraskan countryside for any more hours. They had already done it for so long, they just figured, let's find this person, at least see if they know where we could go, and then we'll be on our way. And so they walked around for a bit until they eventually ended up by the silo. And when they got close to it, they could see that there appeared to be cellar doors on the ground. Mr. Mays interrupts this part of the story to say that the class needs to learn from his mistakes. That at this point in his life, he hadn't seen too many horror movies or anything, and he didn't think anything about going into the creepy cellar doors in the middle of nowhere. And, I mean, that's certainly good advice for surviving a horror movie and whatnot, but I think the better advice here would be, don't walk around random bits of property, certainly not in the country. Just seems like such a great way to, get shot. I mean, yes, given the context of the story, and what Mr. Mays will describe going further, great advice. Don't go through creepy cellar doors. Don't put yourself in any situation where, little ghosts and ghouls can hurt you, if you believe in those, But, I think the real threat of this story is just Farmer Brown defending his property. I just feel like we're in the only ending of the story where they didn't all get shot the moment they got out of the truck. But that's the advice I think Mr. Mays should have actually gave. But, we'll dive right back into the story now, though. Mr. Mays would say, though, that going through those cellar doors was the worst mistake of his life. Mr. Mays told the class he would share all the details that he could, that he felt appropriate sharing to the class, but that anyone who was squeamish would be advised to leave now. Jack would see that a few people did so, with some being genuinely scared, and others just looking for an excuse to skip class and celebrate Halloween a little bit early. Jack, however, stayed seated, completely invested in the story. Immediately after opening the cellar door, a foul stench would hit everyone's noses coming from somewhere deep within. They all began to gag and back away, but interestingly, from opening the door and getting hit with that smell, they decided they needed to go into the cellar and find the source of the smell. Why? So descending down it, they found that it wasn't much of a cellar, but more a long hallway. This place was only being illuminated by light bulbs hanging from the ceilings every few yards, meaning it was only illuminated enough so that they could just barely see. The walls were lined with metal sheeting, similar to the types you would see on the roof of farms. The hallway itself was crooked and jagged. It didn't go in a straight line, but broke off and sort of zigzagged. And the ceiling, too, just lowered and rose unpredictably, as though someone had just sporadically dug through here and then put the siding up and just called it a day. The worst part, Mr. Mays told us, was that the light bulbs constantly flickered, sometimes acting like a strobe light and making it very difficult to move through the winding and unstable hallways. In hindsight, he was certain that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he remembered seeing flashes of things that couldn't be there. He said that when you are that focused on something, or if you are that nervous, your mind can do that to you. It can simply revolt, showing you things or people that aren't there. He continued to describe the hallway, and I was on the edge of my seat. The halls were windy and seemed to go on forever. Mr. Mays guessed that they were somewhere under the creepy forest that they had driven through. They must have walked for miles, when finally, they saw at the end of the hallway, a door. The place that they were in was weird and unsettling enough, but there was something about this door that sat at the end of this long and winding and thrown together hallway, just felt so much more wrong than anything else here did. It wasn't grimy or uneven like the rest of this place was. It was a nice wooden door, the type you would see at the front of a suburban house. Even the doorknob and accompanying knocker didn't have any sign of weathering, and it looked as though the door had just had a fresh coat of red paint painted onto it. One of the friends approached the door. He turned around to face the rest of his friends and joked I should probably knock first. It was kind of a way to ease the tension. And then, he did just that, grabbing the knocker and knocking several times. The sound of the knocking filled the dirt hallway behind them, resonating off the metallic sheeting and filling all of their ears. But there was only silence that followed. And after about 30 seconds of waiting, the group decided that nothing was going to happen. The friend shrugged his shoulders and began walking back towards the group, but as he did, the light bulb in front of him suddenly surged and then exploded. The shock of that caused one of the metal panels to fall down and land on the friend by the door, and as it did, it cut his forehead clean open. When the panel hit his head, he had been knocked unconscious, which caused him to fall and hit the door, which made it open, and he fell through the opening. The group all ran over to help their friend, but because of the light bulb exploding and the spacing of the lights in the hallway, it was super hard to see. But though the hallway was dim, they could tell that behind this door, it was pitch black. Mr. Mays was the first one to make it to his friend's side, and he took off his jacket and wrapped it around the wound on his buddy's forehead, trying to sort of stop or slow the bleeding. Once he had, he noticed something strange. His arm was wet. Not with blood, but by something that was dripping on him from above. He looked up into the pitch black room, hoping his eyes would adjust and allow him to see what was dripping on him, but he couldn't quite catch it, and as he's looking up, he hears one of his friends say, in a panic, "The lights. We have to go." And sure enough, most of the lights that had illuminated the hallway, even if just barely, a few seconds ago, had all gone out. All they could see was the tiny glow of when you turn a light off quickly that hangs around for just a few seconds, and Mr. Mays would say that in that hallway, it looked like 20 little stars just lining their path. However, there was still one light on in the hallway. It was just very far back from where they sat, so they could see just barely. And because of that, and because of their eyes becoming accustomed to the darkness now, they began to be able to make out what was in this room. Though they couldn't exactly make out details, they could tell there was something in front of them, about 10 feet from where the friend stood in the doorway, but they couldn't tell what it was. But then suddenly one of the light bulbs flickered to life, and they could see exactly what stood in that room with them. In the dim light, he could see children, at least 20 of them in just the visible light. They were all dressed in nightgowns that looked to be tattered and torn, stained dark with something. Their hair was long. Every single one of them looked like they had not had a haircut since birth. Some of the children were almost completely obscured by the length of it. Every single one of them didn't appear to have seen a shower or nice bath in their entire life. None of the children moved. They just stared at the friends who were too paralyzed with fear to do anything but stare right back. They were all snapped out of their trance by the sound of an animal in the distance. It was a sick yelping sound, almost like a dog crying out, but it was far too loud for any dog to make. This scared the group of friends, who quickly began picking up their unconscious friend and trying to get out of there. But as they did, the children too began to walk towards them. Luckily, they got their friend up and carried him out of there. Mr. Mays hurried to get up, and as he did, due to the fear and adrenaline, he slipped and had to catch himself on something on the wall. He felt a metal pipe on his hands and used it to kind of pull himself up as he got to his feet. But as he did, he took a look at what he grabbed and saw that it was the source of whatever was dripping on him. It was a shower head. It stuck about a foot into the dark room. He couldn't tell what it had been dripping, but he hoped it was just dirty water. As he got to his feet, he looked around one more time and saw that in this room there were dozens of them, just shower heads sticking out of the wall, all at varying different lengths and heights. He told the class that because of this, he would go on to call this place the Showers. He would run out, slamming the red door behind him, and never looked back. Mr. Mays and his friends would all make it to the truck and would drive away from there, with Mr. Mays warning the class not to go exploring any abandoned farmhouses while they were out trick-or-treating tonight. And then class was dismissed, with Mr. Mays wishing everyone a happy Halloween. There would be discussions among the classmates in the hallway, everyone theorizing of what the Showers could have been, what purpose that place could have served. But there was something off to Jack. Something about the way Mr. Mays had told the story seemed odd to him. See, for the first half, he had been telling it just like he would a normal campfire story, having that sort of spooky voice cadence that you would to try and scare people. But when he got to the part where the light bulb surged and the panel fell down and hit his friend, Mr. Mays began speaking differently. He had dropped the spooky campfire storytelling facade and had taken on a much more serious tone. Jack was sure he wasn't conscious of doing this, but it sounded like the last bit of the story was difficult for Mr. Mays to get through, as though he was reliving a rough memory. And so a few days later, Jack would ask Mr. Mays after class about the story, feeling that there was more to it than Mr. Mays had let on. But to his credit, Mr. Mays would tell Jack that there was nothing to worry about, that everyone was fine, and Mr. Mays would whisper to Jack that a lot of the creepy stuff they saw was probably a result of some of the substances they were under the influence of, and he would give Jack a wink as a way of sort of telling him, don't tell anyone about that last part. And just a few months later, Jack would have to move once more for his parents' work, ending up halfway across the country. But Jack would carry on in his old ways, telling urban legends still, only now Jack had a new favorite, the story of the Showers. Only he would change the ending slightly, saying that the friend had died of blood loss or trauma or something along those lines, just as a way to try and make it creepier and more tragic of a tale to his classmates. Coincidentally, years later, Jack would attend college in the same part of the country that Mr. Mays had been his teacher at, and in his junior year, he and Mr. Mays would actually reunite. One night, Jack went out to a bar that he frequented with his friends, and there, sitting at the counter, he saw a figure that he recognized. He was leaning on the bar with his head in his arms, a half-drank drink sitting next to him. Jack wasn't even sure this was him. This was a guy that seemed down on his luck, almost passed out at a bar. A far sight from the Mr. Mays Jack remembered, but then he saw the shirt he was wearing. It was a sweater that Mr. Mays had worn on his birthday that said, "I'm the birthday boy." So Jack went up to him and asked if it was Mr. Mays. And Mr. Mays would raise his head, look at Jack, and smile, asking how he was doing. But Jack could tell there really wasn't any actual recognition behind his look, and he was sure Mr. Mays as a teacher got this all the time, old students coming out to him that he just didn't remember. But Jack would go on to introduce himself, saying he was Jack, that he had Mr. Mays a few years ago, and with this, Mr. Mays actually seemed to remember him, and offered Jack a seat next to him. The two would go on to talk for hours. Mr. Mays would ask Jack what he had been up to, and he would tell him about college, that he was getting a degree in English because he wanted to be a writer. And Mr. Mays would tell Jack that he was still teaching at the same school he had been at all those years ago. And when Jack asked him all around how he had been, Mr. Mays said things were as good as they had been and ever were going to get. And even when Jack's friends had left, Jack stayed at the bar talking to his old teacher, catching up like old friends. And they'd have a much more adult conversation than typically a student and teacher would, as now that relationship was gone. They were just two guys catching up, having a drink at a bar. And I don't mean more adult as in it was inappropriate, just far more deep and personal. Mr. Mays would tell Jack about his divorce, his children, how he'd kind of been struggling for a while. And Jack felt that he actually cared, in a way he probably wouldn't have as a young man. But now Mr. Mays, this teacher that he had idolized and held in such high regard for all these years as just the perfect teacher, he still held that, but he felt a lot more like a real person to him now, one with depth and issues and troubles. And after several hours of conversing with him, Jack would actually tell Mr. Mays about the influence that the Showers had had on his life, saying that it was a great story, that he had always gone on and loved urban legends, but that the Showers was his favorite, and he would tell people about it whenever it got brought up around campfires or in situations where telling a horror story would be appropriate. It was always the standout in these settings. But Mr. Mays would get serious and look at Jack, telling him that he regretted telling that story for all those years, that he shouldn't have, that he only did because his therapist told him it would help. Jack was puzzled by this. A therapist? What did Mr. Mays mean? But Mr. Mays said of course he needed a therapist. Did Jack really think that what Mr. Mays had gone through wouldn't have messed him up? No, Mr. Mays had developed a drinking problem to cope with what had happened to him all those years ago. It's why he was here now. It's why his life had fallen apart. The showers had done something to Mr. Mays, and he couldn't live with it comfortably. It had messed him up to the core, and ultimately was what he blamed for everything negative that had happened to him since. But Jack said everyone was okay, though. Everyone got out fine. You told me all those years ago everyone was okay. And then Mr. Mays would tell the real story of what happened. See, everything that had happened up to the point of his friend getting injured had actually happened. And most things after that happened as well, exactly like Mr. Mays had said. The only difference came when it came to getting their friend out of there. His friend, the one who had been knocked unconscious, he didn't make it. And he didn't pass away as a result of trauma or blood loss or any other thing that would make sense. Jack even used those when retelling his story because they would make sense as how someone could pass away. He did it to make the story more graphic, of course, but now he's hearing that this friend had died and was wondering how. But it wasn't from that. It wasn't from anything pertaining to do with his injury at all, other than him being susceptible from being unconscious. The children that were in that room with them, had taken him. All of them approached and swarmed and grabbed the friend and dragged him back into the darkness. And Mr. Mays and his friends could do nothing but flee. And just like they said in the story, they would flee, get outside, make it to the truck, but instead of, just leaving and going home, they would actually call the cops and tell them, something happened to our friend, there's something going on here. The cops would come and say that the friends were under the influence of something, that they were sure he had just gotten too messed up and wandered off into the woods, and wildlife had taken him, that maybe he would show up, but a body was never found. Mr. Mays would conclude by telling Jack that he wasn't sure what that place was. He didn't know what purpose the shower served or why it was there. All he knew was that it was a bad place. They would talk for a few minutes more, but Mr. Mays would get a phone call, saying that his ride was outside to pick him up. He would finish his drink and tell Jack how nice it was catching up with him, telling him that he's got a good head on his shoulders and that he's going to do well in life. Mr. Mays would head out the door, but Jack would chase after him, wanting to know one more detail about the story that he had been obsessed with for all these years. He ran out and asked Mr. Mays where the showers was, and Mr. Mays would say it was in Broken Bow, Nebraska. And that would be the last time Jack would see Mr. Mays. About a month later, Mr. Mays would pass away of liver failure. Jack was at least happy enough to say that Mr. Mays was fortunate enough to die surrounded by friends and family. And Jack considered writing a letter to the family, letting them know what a great man Mr. Mays was, that students cared about him, that he had such a positive impact on people's lives, but ultimately the timing wasn't right. It wasn't like him and Mr. Mays were friends or anything outside of their brief interaction, so he withheld. And in retrospect, Jack wished Mr. Mays could have heard about what Jack was planning to do, so he could talk him out of it. Mr. Mays would never know that him telling that story to that class that one day, all those years ago, would go on to ruin a person's life forever. That person, of course, is Jack, because after graduating college, Jack and his friend Steve would decide that they wanted to go on a road trip around the country, one almost mirroring the trip that Mr. Mays and his friends had taken. They decided to go from New York to Colorado, stopping at various places along the way, and they would stay there for about a month, camping, hiking, just enjoying their time off. Around the time that they were getting ready to head back to New York, when they were invited out to a party, and they would go and join, and they would have a good time, and the party really isn't important. What's important is where it led them. See, they were sitting around a fire telling ghost stories, and Jack would tell the story of the showers. Only this time, he told it exactly the way Mr. Mays had told it the first time. He didn't change the ending or anything. He told it exactly how he heard it in that class, sophomore year of high school, sort of as a silent respect to his fallen teacher. And afterwards, when him and Steve were driving back to their hotel, Steve would ask about it, and Jack would tell him the story, how he had always been obsessed with urban legends, how one day in class his teacher had told this outstanding story to all of them, and then he had told him about him and Mr. Mays' interaction at the bar. And Steve would say, well, why don't we try and find it? If you know the city it's in, we have the time. We don't have anything to do for a while. We're still on our trip. Why don't we go to Nebraska and try and find this place? And Jack was hesitant for a while. After all, he saw the effect it had on Mr. Mays, how much it had ruined his life. But Jack was still a skeptic. He figured that there was probably some rational explanation to what happened to Mr. Mays' friend, and he was curious. And oddly enough, some part of him also felt that this too would serve as a sort of tribute to Mr. Mays. Regardless of Mr. Mays calling that place hell on earth and saying how it ruined his life, I don't think Mr. Mays would have wanted Jack to go, personally. But Jack's a horror story protagonist. So of course, after a few days of pondering it, he tells Steve, why not? Let's go to Broken Bow, Nebraska and see if we can find this place. And that's exactly what they would do. They would rent a hotel in the town for several nights and would spend the days driving around, going down dirt roads, trying to find where the showers could be. If it was still there at all, even. They would even ask locals about it, asking if they'd heard of the showers, but of course that sparked no reaction from anyone. Even if this was a known place, that probably wouldn't be the name of it, since that's just what Mr. Mays had decided to call it after seeing all the shower heads. So they would go on to describe it to people, but no one really knew what they were talking about, until at one point they went to a gas station and asked the lady at the counter. She, of course, had no reaction to the name The Showers, like anyone else did, but when they described it, she cut them off, saying, people don't deal with anything relating to that sort of business around here anymore. That was all a long time ago. They would try to press her for more, but she would politely excuse herself from the conversation. A few days later, around 7 p.m., Jack and Steve would be driving around once again, where they would find a dirt road that headed into a wooded area, just like Mr. Mays had said the path to the showers had in the story. Rejuvenated with energy that this could be the right place, they went down it. However, it was clear that this place hadn't been traversed in quite some time, as there were plenty of debris and tree limbs that were all over the path, so they would have to keep getting out of the car to clear the road before they could continue down their path. And eventually, near the end of the path, there was a giant tree that had fallen. There was just no way they were going to be able to move that, but they could see up ahead past it was a clearing. Now, because of how long it had taken them to get here, needing to get out of the car over and over again to clear the road, it was pretty well nighttime by now. So they turned the brights on to sort of illuminate in front of them further. Still couldn't quite see, but they got out of the car, made their way forward up to the clearing, and with getting closer and the lights from the car, they could see that in this clearing was an old farm building. He approached it, seeing that there was a large metal sliding door. He was getting excited now. The puzzle pieces were falling together. There was the dirt road in the wooded area, the open clearing out of nowhere, and then the farm building with the sliding door. Steve came up behind Jack and gave him a flashlight, and the two would try and open the door, but it was rusted and heavy, and it took a while, but eventually, after tugging on it with a loud creak, the door would slide back onto the track and open up. And when they looked inside the building, they would see that it was completely empty. The building was clearly abandoned, but it wasn't like most abandoned buildings, where you would find food wrappers, bottles from people who had come in there, or signs of wildlife that have crept in. The inside, though being empty, was pristine. There wasn't anything in there at all. It was as though it was closed one day, years and years ago, judging from how dilapidated the outside was, and the negligence of the path, and then just nothing had touched it since. Not so much as a bug had come to this place. There were no cobwebs, there was hardly even dust. Just like they closed the door and then this place was trapped in time. But as they began looking around, there was just nothing there. Nothing at all. I mean, it was big enough where they had plenty of area to search, but there were a couple things that stood out to Jack. One, the lights above weren't like they were in the story. He could see that there were lights, but they didn't work, and with how bright they were described in Mr. Mays' story, he just figured that maybe they'd work, but they'd had to stick to their flashlights. And Mr. Mays had described this place as being massive, almost warehouse size. And while the building they were in was certainly large, it wasn't the monolith that Mr. Mays had described. And so as Steve is getting giddy looking around the place, Jack would go and tell him, this probably isn't the right place. Steve would protest, saying, I mean, how do you know? What makes you think it's not the right place? And Jack would point out those things, but would also point out one big detail, one that was in the story that wasn't on this property. There was no silo outside. Remember, the silo was how they got into the showers in the first place, since there was the cellar beneath it. With no silo, there was likely no showers. And Steve realized that Jack was probably right. Although everything else had pretty well checked the boxes, that was a big detail, and it was entirely possible that it had been knocked down. But looking around outside, they couldn't see any sign of the cellar doors. It's not that they weren't there, but there just didn't seem to be any apparent sign of it. The building didn't check out completely, even though it was a close match, and they just didn't figure it was worth walking around this property forever just trying to find him. So they came up with a solution. They said that since they'd already gone through all the effort of coming out here, they might as well just tell people they'd found the showers whenever they recount the story. And Jack agreed that was a good idea. But Steve was going to go to the car and get his camera to take photos so they could have proof whenever they would show people. And so as Steve went to do that, Jack would look around just a little bit more in the building, just wanting to take it all in. After all, they had come all the way out here. They'd found something at least. It was worth checking out. It was very quiet when I was alone in there. I could hear the faint sound of Steve running through the brush into the car. But once he was far enough away, everything was quiet. I remember not even hearing the wind or the chirping of crickets as I walked deeper into the dark, flashlight in hand. I was convinced that there had to be something. As I approached the far corner of the room, the sound of my feet scratching against the dirt was interrupted by a soft, hollow thud. I stopped, trying to figure out what it was. I put my foot down hard against the ground and heard it again. I stomped one more time, realizing that the floor that I was standing on was covering something hollow. I walked to the wall of the room, looking carefully at the floor to try and spot any holes or gaps. As far as I had known, it was solid ground that this thing sat atop, so I was convinced that I had found a hatch or basement or something. I heard Steve coming back through the brush as I shouted, "Steve, come over here, it's As I went to say the word hollow, I hopped a little bit, hoping to recreate the sound so that he would be able to hear it upon entering the door. The second that my feet made contact with the floor, I felt it give out beneath me. Jack would land poorly, actually knocking himself unconscious, as when he came to, he saw a light shining down on him, and for a few seconds, just feeling the pain, realizing that he had fallen and, lost consciousness, he thought this was like the light at the end of the tunnel. So Jack thought he died, and his initial thoughts weren't of, a young life taken too soon. They weren't about his friends and family, but instead Jack was mad that he had died in Nebraska, of all places. Sorry, Nebraska. Of course, this light wasn't God. It was Steve shining his light down, looking at his friend, who asked if Jack was okay. Jack would take a moment to sort of audit his condition. He was confident he was concussed from being knocked out, and his head was throbbing, but more urgently to him was the pain in his knee. It was agonizing, and he wouldn't be able to put too much weight on it. He figured that would definitely need to be a hospital visit. But he was alive, which 5 seconds prior he didn't think he was, so he was doing better than he thought. He told as such to Steve, and Steve said he would need to get a rope to get Jack out of there. And Jack would take a moment to actually look at where he was. He had fallen into some sort of basement, but even with his flashlight, it was so dark and went so far back that he couldn't see any other walls except the one he had fallen by, which was smooth and concrete. So he certainly wasn't going to be able to climb out of there. Steve had a rope in the car, but the car was obviously a ways away from being blocked by the tree, and the rope was in a hiking bag that was put pretty well underneath the rest of the stuff they'd packed, so it was going to take him a few to get it. But they didn't really have any other options, so Jack sat down, and Steve went to go get the rope to help his friend out. After the sound of Steve's footsteps faded away, Jack was alone, in complete silence, and, minus his flashlight, complete darkness too. And he sat there for a bit, until he could hear something to his left. It sounded like breathing. He tried to chalk it up to just his imagination, something as a result of the concussion, but then Mr. Maze's story came into his head, and he began to get scared. So he grabbed his flashlight and shined it over to his left to see that there was nothing. Jack was completely alone in this sub-level of the building. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, turned off his flashlight. He needed to relax. He was hurt. He just needed to sit there and wait on Steve to come help, and try not to get in his own head about this. But then, somewhere in the darkness about 10 feet in front of him, he heard a scraping sound, as though something was being dragged across the dirt floor. And before he even had time to shine his light in that direction, he heard the sound of breathing to his left once more. He tried to reason that his concussed brain was just basically imagining sounds to try and fill the silence that he was experiencing, but he was getting freaked out. He put his flashlight in his pocket, reasoning that shining it at every little sound he thought he heard would just be a way for him to drive himself crazy down here as he waited on Steve. So he pocketed it, and then painfully made his way up to his feet. He didn't want to sit down here any longer, and figured that somewhere down here, there'd have to be a ladder or stool or something he could use to get himself out. So he began wandering around. That was until he had only walked a few yards, and hit his head on something hard, which caused him to tumble to the ground once again. He swore at himself, doing further damage to his already concussed head, when he felt something wet on his forehead. Instantly, he thought he had sliced his forehead open on whatever he had cut it on, and reached up to sort of, wipe it away. And when he did, he turned on the flashlight just to see how bad it was. When he saw it wasn't blood that he'd wiped away, but what looked like a sort of dirty water. And then he felt a drip. Words lack the ability to describe the way I felt when I heard the drip noise again, and saw yet another tiny ball of liquid fall into the puddle. I think I knew, even then, exactly what the source was, but I was endlessly trying to convince myself I was wrong. I lifted the flashlight up and pointed it to the source of the liquid. What stared back at me was a pipe that protruded at least a foot from the cement wall. The metal was rusted and cracked. Little bits of the liquid began to seep from them. At the end of the pipe was a simple shower head, aimed down toward the ground. Jack threw up as a result of shock and the concussion, some combination of both. This is what he had wanted. Jack had wanted to find the showers. That's why he and Steve had come here. They were disappointed that they didn't find them. But now in Jack's current state, where he was concussed, had a leg that he could barely walk on because of his knee, alone, in the darkness, with Steve surely out of earshot's distance by now. Jack was horrified. He forced himself back up to his feet and began staggering down the hallway, not wanting to sit there any longer. He had his flashlight out and was illuminating the path in front of him as far as it would go. It barely cut through the darkness, and he could see more shower heads poking out at all different heights. He would duck and maneuver around them as he hugged the wall trying to support himself. He didn't care. He just needed to keep going to find an exit. He had convinced himself that at the end of whatever hallway he was going down, there would be an exit. And the further and further he went down this hallway, the more he noticed a smell became apparent. It smelled like vomit. It smelled like vile. It smelled like burnt hair, and it smelled like rot. But he didn't stop. He didn't let it falter him. He didn't let the gags he was experiencing as a result slow him down. He just pulled his shirt over his nose and kept going. I was still moving against the wall when I fell into some sort of outlet. I hit the dirt ground hard, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The pain still managed to break through, though. My flashlight was still in my hand. I aimed it and examined my surroundings. Sitting in front of me was a doorway. There was a door there, though it looked aged now. It had a nice little design on it, a doorknob and a knocker that looked like a snarling demon. Red paint was peeling from it, flaking off and falling onto the ground in front of me. I clumsily rose and busted through the door, narrowly missing a piece of hanging sheet metal in front of me. I was crawling now. There was no way that I could run. The walls and ceiling were lined with metal, the kind that you would see on the roof of a farm. Large pieces of wood seemed to brace the sheets, holding this makeshift tunnel together. I couldn't risk sliding against that and possibly cutting myself on the metal, or hitting the wood and causing a cave-in. So I crawled. It felt like he was crawling for miles and miles before he finally came across where the path began to upslope. And looking up, he could see there was a little sliver of light coming through something in front of him, and he squinted and got closer and got a better look, and he could see that this was a cellar door. Relief instantly flooded through him. He had found his exit, his escape to this place. He crawled up to it and threw his way into it. But the door didn't open. The door was locked. He tried to let out a scream, but due to the pain and exhaustion, all he could do was let out an exhausted cry as tears began to go down his face. He could just stare at the door and the light on the other end that signified his exit. It was taunting him, and he could just sat there and stare at the light in defeat. And to add insult to injury, in his moment of weakness, he heard from the tunnel behind him something moving. It sounded as though whatever it was being dragged through the tunnel, moving only a few paces at a time before taking a break and then resuming. all the while moving towards Jack's direction. Jack used his trembling hands and pointed the flashlight in the direction of the sound. Try as Jack might, all these years later, writing this story, he tries to convince himself that he hallucinated this best part. To the best of his ability, he wants to believe that it wasn't real, that it was his concussed brain just making up more stuff to fill the darkness, like he hoped the sounds were earlier, but he knows that isn't true. In front of him, he saw a child. The child was wearing a white gown that had been far stained with dark splotches and occasional deep spots of red. He could make out the reflection of an eye through his flashlight, but it sort of came in and out behind tufts of long black hair that covered their entire body almost. Their fingernails were caked with dirt as they just trudged towards Jack. And every step it took, every movement it made seemed to be labored, as though it was difficult or even painful for this child to do so. But it just kept coming towards him. And as it got closer, Jack could read the expression on its face and saw that it was rage. This thing was livid. It was angry that Jack was here. Jack began to cry, knowing that this thing meant him harm, knowing that there was nothing he could do. He couldn't escape. He was too badly wounded to move, and he certainly wasn't going to go near this thing. And then he heard a voice from behind him, from the other end of the cellar door, that just said, "Hey, Jack." And Jack was confident that it was Steve. Jack tried to respond. He wanted to tell Steve to open the door to get him out of here. But in his fear and in his pain, all he could do was let out a cry as he began clawing and banging on the cellar door. But in his panic, he had dropped the flashlight, which had rolled down the slope and landed at the child's feet. The voice would ask Jack what he saw, telling him to describe it to him. But Jack told Steve he was in no mood. Just open the door. He wasn't messing around. He was in danger. And then he heard Steve say, "Rest for a second. I'll get it." Jack would close his eyes and beg for Steve to just hurry up and get it, just to open the door so he could leave this place. And he would open his eyes once again for just a split second, just to see tufts of hair right in front of his face, and a small child's face peering at him from behind it. He slammed his eyes shut once again and began bellowing for Steve to open the door, when suddenly it did, and Jack was able to roll out, slamming the cellar door behind him and locking it, leaving that child down in there. He would lay on the grass and catch his breath for a moment before asking Steve why. Why didn't he just open the door when he told him to? Why did he have to play around? He turned around and saw Steve wasn't there. He figured he was hiding somewhere in the shrubbery around him and began yelling for Steve, looking for him, when he saw, way off in the distance, on the other side of the building, Steve was running from the car to the entrance of the building with a rope in hand. Jack would turn to face the cellar door once more to see his flashlight laying on the outside, and Jack would pass out. Steve would eventually find Jack over by the cellar door, a good ways away from the building, and would pick him up, help him to the car, and they would take him to the hospital. Jack would try and justify to himself that everything he had seen was a result of a very, very bad concussion. And though he could explain most things away with that, even if he didn't truly believe it, what he couldn't explain was the cellar door, because he knew that it was locked. And then suddenly, it wasn't, and he had no explanation for how that happened or how he got out of there. Jack ends this all by saying he's still a skeptic. He doesn't believe in ghost stories or anything along those lines, doesn't believe in urban legends, but he does believe what happened to him at the showers was real, as much as he wants it not to be. And unfortunately, Jack would end up very similar to Mr. Mays, now developing a drinking problem to cope with what he had seen, to put himself to sleep at night when the nightmares were too much, trying to convince himself that what he had seen was just a hallucination, but knowing deep down that there truly was something at the showers of Broken Bow, Nebraska. And that was the showers. I heard the story for the first time many years ago, and I loved it. To me, it is just the perfect blending of urban legend and creepypasta. And there are other stories that do this great too, like the Goat Man, which I talked about in my last creepypasta video. But I think the showers is just a great story all around. And it was a story I definitely wanted to do justice to by giving it its own video here today. But that's pretty well going to do it for me today. So I really hope you all enjoyed the story. If you did, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all the stuff actual YouTubers tell you to do. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone so very much for watching. And I really hope you all have a great day.